how we grow food. There's so many different methods depending on someone's experience, maybe what they have researched online, location. So in reality, is really for beginners and experts, because it doesn't matter how much we have learned in a given subject related to growing food or agriculture or homesteading. Similar to business, regardless of how much experience you've had, there's always something that you could learn. So I really appreciate you being here. And can you, start out just telling us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, and what you do related to worms?
Yeah. So I think everything you said is so important, right? And I didn't know how important all of this was to my life. So taking this a little far back, I was born in Germany. My grandparents still live there. A lot of my family still lives there. And they lived off the land, right? They did a lot of their own, they had land to be able to grow their own orchard. They had their own fruits and vegetables. So when you're talking about a food forest, it's literally what they had. They had, I believe it was about a half an acre, 3/4 of an acre inside of a forest, literally, that was all cut out. And they were growing all of their own food. And then they would barter that with other things that other people had in the village. And as I grew older, I noticed that I was growing everywhere that I went, everywhere that I moved. So I joined the military, and every time I moved somewhere else, I was growing stuff, whether that was inside on the patio. If I had a yard, I would grow in the yard. And then I met my current wife and girlfriend at the time, right? Moved in with her, and she had a garden. And she had this massive garden bed that took up the entire patio. And I was like, hey, can we move this so we have more access to the backyard, because it was kind of cutting off the yard? And she said, sure. So when I started moving it, I noticed that she had a massive amount of worms. And I didn't understand why there were so many. And then I asked her, why do you have so many worms? And she couldn't tell me. So my curiosity always gets the better of me. So I jumped down in the rabbit hole, like, why are worms good? And I found out, oh, there's black gold. Like there's something to this. And I was like, okay, cool. Let's see where this goes, right? So I bought some worms, killed a lot of worms, killed a lot of more worms. And it was a trial and error to figure out how to keep these worms alive, right? And eventually I figured out that I could breed these worms. And then I was like, hey, is there a way that, I can sell these worms for a profit? And then I was like, okay, there's a market for that. And then I wasn't happy with the information that was out there when people started asking me, why do I need worms? What is their purpose? So I took a deep dive into worm anatomy and soil biology, and that's where I kind of ended up right now. I'm on a soil biology kick, I guess you can say, until that changes. And that kind of got me to where I am now, and I understand what Mother Nature is actually doing from a natural standpoint, and what worms bring to the soil, and what they do for the plants at the end of the day. It's super important, and I found myself enjoying this portion of it. There is a lot of chemistry that goes along with that, but it hurts my brain and it hurts my head a little bit. The biology side of the house is a little easier for me to understand. And all I really wanted to do is share this information with other people. So I teach classes in my local community. I help other people understand what's actually going on, the symbiotic relationship that soil has with plants, and the intricate role that worms play in this cycle. So that's kind of how I got to where I'm at now.
That's awesome, man. Through trial, you were growing your own food and you had to move some gardening area, right, with your girlfriend. And then that's how you stumbled upon the whole subject of worms. And definitely a big market there. Definitely a lot of need related to education around worms and how they help a garden, because I think it's obvious, and most people that have gotten into growing their own food, it's common knowledge that hey, yeah, worms are good for the soil, but it's sort of because it's left at a surface level. And I would say that I'm probably there. That I know how important they are, but I haven't gotten into, how you said, breathing them myself, and understanding the biology side of it and the biochemistry as well. So I know that in the next few months and years, you're gonna be able to provide that knowledge out to the internet. So you mentioned at one point something that you're taking a soil kick or like a break. Is that what you said?
Yeah. It's I call it a because I'm a jack of all trades and a master of none. So at some point, I always jump onto something else, right? At first, it was just growing stuff. Then I jumped into worms. Then I jumped into, worm breeding. And then I jumped into worm castings. And then I jumped into soil biology. So I'm sure I won't stay here forever. At some point, something else is going to, what do you say? Something else is going to spark my curiosity, and I'm going to move on to something else. And when I do, I just want to share that knowledge with as many people as I can. So
I see what you're saying. Definitely, man. Hey, and while you were explaining how you got into the business of worms and all of that, you reminded me of a post that I saw on Instagram, and he was talking about container worms, which apparently are actually not beneficial for the soil. And I can't remember the name of them right now. And I was just wondering if off the top of your head, you know what I'm talking about.
not off the top of my head. There are many different types of species, and they live in different layers of the soil, and they all perform a very unique role in the soil. As far as worms that don't benefit the soil, I don't know of any that don't. Now, I do know that there are some worms that are considered invasive, and that I believe it's don't quote me, I don't know the agency. The agency has deemed them as being invasive, and that's the Alabama jumping worm, just because they're feeding on organic material at such a rapid rate that it is leading to erosion in some of the forested areas. But as far as detrimental, I'm not too familiar with a specific worm for that.
It might be that one. I mean, I looked it up, Alabama jumper worm, and it looks similar to the one in the video. And the reason I asked is because, this is very recently that I came across that. It was like an Instagram reel or something. And I've gotten into growing my own food, not the longest, but at least for a couple of years. I would say around 2020 is when I started starting my own seeds and, just learning from scratch. So is what, about 4 years now. And in 4 years, I have never seen anybody talk negative about worms. And then all of a sudden I saw this video and I was sort of surprised. So that's why I was a bit skeptical on whether the person from the video was actually correct or not. So, hey, I guess if I find it later, I'll send it to you. But you mentioned a little bit already on this, and is next to my question, which would be, how do worms and composting play a role in building and maintaining living soil?
That's a great question, and this is a question that I get quite often. So everybody understands the process for composting, right? You put specific organic material, carbon and nitrogen, with a specific ratio, some moisture, into a pile, and it decomposes over time, which is the normal process that happens out in nature, right? Because trees drop leaves, things die, and then it decomposes over time. The role that worms play is they're coming in, and a lot of people think that they're eating organic material, and they are ingesting some, but they're actually eating the microorganisms that are breaking those things down. And there's a couple of scientific studies that are out there that talk about the ability of a worm to multiply biology. So when we're looking at a compost pile, the compost pile is all biology that is breaking down all this organic material, right? We've got bacteria, fungi, protozoas, nematodes. We've got all these microorganisms breaking these organic materials down, and then there's different sets of microorganisms that come in depending on the decomposition phase, right? So depending on the temperatures that are there, whether you're in a mesophilic or thermophilic phase, different microorganisms will come in, and then usually at the end of everything, when things start cooling down, your fungi starts coming in, and all of these microorganisms play a crucial role in cycling nutrients for the soil, right? They all play an intricate role. They all provide something to the soil, and in turn, they're providing nutrients for your plants. So what role do worms play into this, right? So worms have the ability to take in microorganisms and then multiply them in their gut. And that's important because you ever go to a buffet? Yeah?
I haven't been in a while, but yes.
So if you go to a buffet, would you rather have 10 things to choose from or 100?
The more, the better. 100.
The more, the better, right? The same thing goes for a living soil. The same thing goes for a compost pile. The same thing goes for worm castings, right? The same thing goes for things that your plants need. We want to provide the massive amount of things. And in this case, we want to talk about microorganisms. So there was a study that was done by, I think it's Agro Data, don't quote me on that, but they looked at compost, they looked at bokashi, they looked at worm castings, and I believe there was a fourth thing, but I can't recall exactly what that was. And they did see DNA sequencing to see the number of species of microorganisms that were in those materials. And when I tell you that worm castings came out on top and it was by a landslide, I'm not joking. The chart was crazy. So when we're talking about
what was the chart measuring?
It was measuring the DNA sequencing of the different types of bacteria in the soil.
Okay.
So when you're talking about going to a buffet and you want more, worm castings give you more. And by providing a multitude of different types of species, all of those species perform a specific task in the soil, whether they're breaking down the organic material, whether they're breaking down the minerals, whether they're providing magnesium, zinc, iron, potassium, nitrogen. They all perform a different function. So we want as many microorganisms in the soil as possible. So that's the bacteria side of the house. But when it comes to fungi, we need all of the microorganisms, right? So worms have the ability to also multiply the different number of species when it comes to fungi. Now, one thing that's different is that when we're looking at bacteria, what goes in multiplies. So if you take in 2, it poops out, the worm poops out like 10. I don't know the specific ratio, but there's more of it. Now, when it comes to fungi, there's not more fungi. So if you compare worm castings to a compost, you're going to have more fungal biomass, which is the amount of fungi in that compost compared to a worm casting. But what makes it different is that you're going to get different species. You're going to have a more variety. You're going to have a bigger variety of fungal species in a worm castings than you're going to have in a compost. All research studies that were done and accomplished. So this goes back to the buffet. What kind of buffet do you want? What kind of buffet are you providing to your plants, right? I want the best buffet. I want all the things. I want 10 different types of chicken, 20 different types of steak, right? Like I want all of the cakes, pies, right? I'm a sweets guy. I like pastries. I like, like that's what I like. So I want all the pastries. Give me everything. So that's why worms are important to a living soil. When we're talking about a living soil is living. It's an organism on its own, and we have to provide everything that we possibly can to feed nature, so that nature can provide for the plants. And if we can do that, then we give our plants the best probability of surviving, right? It's just like the buffet. Like my kids, if I take them to the buffet at Caesar's, they're gonna love it. But if I take them to the Chinese buffet, they're gonna be like, what is this, right? So I just want the plants to be as happy as possible. So that biodiversity, I want as much as possible in the soil. And that's what I want to share with other people. And this is why I feel that worms are so important. If you don't have the worms, you don't have the biodiversity that you're looking for. And we want that biodiversity because we want the plants to have the best chance at surviving.
Thank you for that. It's a good introduction on someone that's trying to understand the benefits of using worms, adding them to their garden, and additionally to composting, right? Because we're not saying to don't compost anymore. We're just saying incorporate worms into your whole operation. And what comes to mind is, what is the difference between adding worms to, let's say, your garden or to your compost versus the worms castings? So when do you add them? What is the process?
So let's talk about when to utilize castings and when to utilize worms, or in the what would prompt you to do one or the other, and then we'll talk about application. So I always tell people that I'm lazy. I'm a lazy gardener. I want to do the least amount of work possible to get the highest yield, the highest, the less effort, more outcome, right? So if I have worm castings, I have to apply that to a plant, preferably down to the root, right? So every time I transplant, every time I put something into the soil, I need to provide some of that biology to the plant. Because more than likely, if I purchased it from the store, it might have been grown in synthetics, probably more than likely, and it probably has zero biology in there. So as soon as I put it into my native soil or my soil, it is going to start struggling immediately. So that stress is going to be real, and it's going to be very quick. So I need to get that nutrient cycling up. So I have to apply these worm castings. Now, if you can maintain that ecosystem, that living soil, you shouldn't have to apply worm castings again. But if it dries out, you're going to lose some of those microbes. If the temperature gets too hot, it gets too cold, you're going to lose some microbes. So they'll either die or they'll insist. And the best way I can say is when they insist, they kind of go into a hibernation state. But whether they wake up out of hibernation or not, who knows, right? So if you want to apply worm castings, you can do that. Just know that you're going to have to do it on a regular basis. Now, do you want to do worms? So there's multiple different ways of keeping worms, right? You can keep them in a bin. You can keep them in a container. There's multiple different types of containers. Whether you keep them outside or indoors, you can do that. Now, if you're keeping the worms, you're going to have to sift through that material to get the worm castings, which is more work. I don't want to do more work. I want, more colors, more blooms, bigger growth, more fruits and veggies. I don't want the additional work. So what I always recommend to people is worms live in the soil, right? That's where they live naturally. Put them there. Let them do their own thing. In nature, when trees drop their leaves, when the wind breaks a branch and it hits the ground, right? Microorganisms naturally come in and start breaking those materials down. And then worms come in and they start feeding on that. So we're not interrupting nature. She takes care of herself. So let's do the same thing at home. So if people are getting worms from me, I always tell them, put them in the ground, right? You can feed the worms additionally by creating a worm bin in the middle of your garden, using a wire basket or a bucket with holes in it. Put your food scraps, put organic material into there. That way the worms can feed on that. And then they'll go throughout the garden bed, and then do that as well. So worms feed on on the microorganisms breaking down organic material. But just because you have a food source in the middle doesn't mean that they're going to stay there. I can feed my worms in one area, but I'll find them in another area. So they will wander and go wherever they want to. So That's what I tell people. When should I use worms? When should I just get worm castings? It all depends on how you're growing, right? And what your ultimate goal is. If you don't mind working a little bit harder, getting worms and keeping them in a container, you can do that, right? You have to continually feed them. You will have to make sure the moisture is right and the temperature is right. If you don't want to deal with the worms, if you don't want to keep livestock, because that's basically what you're doing, right? You can just get the worm castings. I would always tell people that you just want to get fresh worm castings. Find a local producer or somebody that has them locally, right? Because as soon as you take oxygen away, you bag it up, right? There's no longer access to oxygen, so things are going to start dying. And what you're doing when you're buying worm castings is you're getting the microbiology. That's what you're really purchasing. So it depends on what you want to do and what you're looking for. So hopefully that puts some clarification on when should I use one, when should I use another. In my opinion, how lazy do you want to be? I'm pretty lazy, so I just put it out in the yard. I chop and drop. That keeps things fed. I top dress with some mulch on top of that to make sure the biology is there, so things are breaking down. The worms just are happy underneath there. So application, right? So how much, when? So we'll start with the worms first. So application rate for worms, right? So if you're looking at worms and you're using them specifically to compost, right? If you have a composting area, then the rule of thumb is about 1,000 worms per square foot, which is a lot of worms. And when I talk about square footage, I'm talking about surface area. So 1,000 worms per square foot is what you're looking at if you're going to compost with worms. I always say you can start out with half of that. It's okay. Just make sure you don't overfeed them. Overfeeding can lead to anaerobic conditions. Anaerobic conditions will kill everything. So don't want to really do that. So application, when do you want to add worms to the yard? Springtime is always a good time. Summertime, depending on your climate region, right? Here in Nevada, Las Vegas, I don't recommend people putting worms in June or July because it's 100. Last year we had record temperatures of 120 degrees for 5 days in a row. You're not going to get a high survival rate, unfortunately. And then depending on where you're putting them, right? So if you put them in the ground, you'll have higher success rate. If you're putting them in a container, it's probably going to be a little less. When we're talking about composting, that's what you're going to kind of look at. If you are looking at just adding worms to your garden, this is a completely different process. And what I like to talk about is Dr. Clive Edwards from Ohio State. He did some research on worms and soil health, and he stated that a healthy soil has between 100 to 300 worms per square yard, so 9 square feet. Now, and what I translated that to is if you go in your backyard or your garden and you take your hand and you get a handful of soil and you look at it, you should have somewhere between 1 or 2 worms, and that's a healthy soil, right? So that's what he states. That's what I go with for a healthy soil. If people are just trying to maintain what they have in their garden and they're not trying to specifically compost with worms. Worms will tear through organic material quite quickly, so you do have to continually feed those guys, right? If you have too many in a system, you're going to tear through that material quite quickly, and you will have soluble nutrients for your plants. But worm castings also have growth regulators in them, which means that they can stunt the growth of a plant at a certain point. So you might get quick, rapid growth or greening, and then it'll stop it for a little while. So you don't want to have too much. You can overdo it. So when you're talking about application of worm castings, how much do I use? We're going to transition from the worms to the worm castings. I like using a little bit. More is not better when it comes to worm castings because of those growth regulators in them, right? In addition to that, not every worm casting is created equal, and they have different amounts of nutrients in them. So sometimes it could be hot, which high nitrogen, right? Normally that's not associated with worm castings, but they could have that in there. So you got to be careful with that. So what I like to tell people is that if you're going to be putting it into a mix, if you're going to have a seed mix, if you're going to have a raised bed mix, if you're going to have a potted mix, you want to stay around 10%. If you go up to 20, you're okay. If you're doing a native soil, you can go a little bit higher depending on how depleted your soil is, right? So that's very specific upon what your soil looks like and what you already have in it. Here in Nevada, I got nothing. Utah, got nothing. There's nothing in those soils, right? It's just bacteria. So adding a little bit more, you're going to be okay with. So, and then if we're talking about how much to add, right? So for those mixes, that's the number that I kind of steer towards, 10 to 20%. That's what I kind of like to stick with. More is not better, so save your money because they are quite expensive, especially if you're getting some of the high quality stuff. Some of that stuff can be really expensive, but you're getting really good biology in it. But if you're adding it to like a transplant, right, which is usually what I like to do, I don't like to mix it in big batches. I just like to add it to the plant really quickly. Small amounts. You're talking about, for like a pint cup, maybe a tablespoon or two at the bottom, close to the roots. When we're talking about microorganisms and cycling nutrients, we want it to be as close to the plant roots as possible. So a tablespoon or two for like a pint is all you need. 10% of the entire container, right? So that's pretty much it when you're adding to a transplant. Little goes a long way. Don't overdo it. Please, guys and gals. Don't overdo it. You can definitely overdo it, and then you won't get the results that you're looking for.
Thank you for that, man. And there's certainly a lot of information to digest, and it takes, of course, dedication for you to become a good gardener and actually be able to produce a high yield for your family, right? But it's wherever you start, little by little you learn. And how you mentioned, it depends on how you are growing, on whether you're gonna use the worms directly or the castings. So understanding your context is so key, right? Before you make any changes or any big moves when it comes to your property or your growing your own food journey. But let's just paint a scenario of an SHTS situation, right? And you're now in your homestead and you now have to survive for an indeterminate amount of time, and you want to be able to amend your soil, feed your garden, right? So you have some worms to start. So how would you then try to keep that cycle going, right? Let's say you start with a small amount of worms somehow. Maybe you kept them or your neighbor gave them to you, but now you want to make that last in an indeterminate amount of time. So how could someone achieve that?
It's a great question. Let me ponder that. How would I, if we had a fallout and you had to maintain your own homestead all on your own, how would I go about this? And if I had a small amount of worms, knowing what I know about biology and how that works in the soil, I think I would keep that small amount of livestock and try to keep them happy and get them to multiply. So I would keep the worms in a small container, keep them fed and happy with the food scraps or anything that I could find on the homestead or the farm, and get them to multiply. I want to be able to get those worm castings initially so that I can inoculate all of the things that I'm growing, right? So I could use the excess material to start a compost pile. That compost pile will keep it going. I could use that to feed the worms, to help produce a different diversity, right? Because we want a bunch of different microorganisms. So I would start a small worm bin and keep those fed and get those to multiply. And then at a certain point when they start becoming too many, I would split that into two, and then I would have two, and I would probably go to about 4 containers worth of worms. And they would probably be about 1 square foot each. So that would mean I would probably get up to about 1,000 worms, 4,000 worms that are in production. And then I would use that in a cycle. I would take 1 bin every month and I would put those out into the garden wherever they needed to be, wherever I needed to grow, until I am happy with the product, or I'm happy with the amount of worms that I have in my garden, and keep that system going. As that's how I would approach the worm situation. Now I'm going to have excess materials that I would do in a compost. And then I would take that compost and I would add that to my soil, right? So depending on what my soil situation is, if it's very depleted, I'm going to use the example here, right? I have 0.3% organic material in my native soil, which is nothing. And if we want to get to a point that has where you're getting a decent amount of production, you need to be somewhere between 3 and 5, I think, for like row crops. So I would take a bunch of compost that I could create within 30 days, and I would just add that to the soil. Usually I can get compost around 21 days, sometimes 18, depending on how quickly you want to turn that material over, how quickly it will decompose. You can go from 18, I think the Berkeley method is 18, the Soil Food Web method is 21, and then there's a couple of other long-term methods that take a little bit longer. So if you're talking about the Johnson-Su method, right, that's going to be a little bit longer, maybe 3 to 4 months. And then traditional composting is going to be probably out to about 6 months or so. What you're really building with the duration is diversity in biology. But what I really want to do is create a organic material that I can add to the soil quite quickly. So a safe product, right? We want to make sure that we're hitting our temperatures and our durations in order to create a product that is safe. I don't want to introduce any pathogens or diseases into my garden, because the whole purpose is for us to survive, right, in this scenario. So I would create a compost, I would add that material to the garden, and I would slowly expand that garden out, adding a minimum of probably 2 or 3 times a year organic material to the soil to get that garden going. And then, like I said, with the transplants, I would be adding worm castings to those transplants and then slowly incorporating those worms out into the garden so they could do everything naturally, so I could be a little more hands off. And I think I would keep that system going. I do chop and drop method, which can be beneficial if done appropriately, and then top dress with some compost on top of the top and chop and drop, and then keep that cycle going, and that would produce for me. And I think that's how I personally would go about keeping a system and a cycle going that would produce and then be sustaining is a good word, self-generating, regenerative, I think could be used in that. It depends, because if I'm taking outside sources from somewhere else, then it's not regenerating. With a composting system, more than likely, it won't be regenerative because I won't have enough organic material to sustain that cycle. So it'd probably be more sustainable than regenerative.
Thank you for that. And I mean, of course, that was an extreme situation, but even just everyday life, it can be applied in that once you start that one bin and you learn it and you get the process down packed, then you could just keep having worms in the long term, right? So that's really why I asked the question. And you mentioned something very interesting, which is the timing of how long it takes for the compost to be ready. And of course, depending on the method of composting that you use, it's going to have different time frames. But then, can you expand a little bit on what you mean by being safe? Why wouldn't compost be safe if, let's say, you put it in the ground in your garden quicker than you should?
So depending on where you're from and what your thought process is, I believe the USDA states that you have to, for a compost to be safe to be able to be used or sold, it has to maintain a temperature of 131 degrees and it has to be turned a minimum of 5 times within 15 days. So on average, a compost facility would probably turn that every 3 days to meet the minimum requirements. So why does that matter? Why does it have to be safe? When we're talking about raising temperatures, so 131 degrees is the minimum required temperature to kill pathogens and diseases. It's kind of like when we cook steak, chicken, or pork, right? You cook at home?
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. So Do you take temperatures of your meat to make sure that you hit certain temperatures to make sure that it's safe for you to eat?
Actually, I don't.
Okay. Well, I can tell you, if you go to a restaurant, they're taking temperatures and they're making sure that that meat is safe for you to eat, right? Because they have to hit minimum requirements in order to kill all of those diseases, all of those pathogens. We're doing the exact same thing with a compost pile, right? When we create a thermophilic compost pile, specifically talking about thermophilic here, right? We want to hit those temperatures to kill those diseases and pathogens so we don't get sick. And if we don't, then we're adding that to the soil, then it gets onto our plants. We've all seen the reports where things get called back because there's a salmonella outbreak, on the lettuce or, whatever other vegetables that are out there. And that is because the material wasn't processed correctly. So we want to make sure that we hit a minimum of 131 degrees for a duration of time. There's different methods out there, whether you use the USDA, which is 5 turns within 15 days. There's also a temperature at time, TAT, duration, where basically you hit certain temperatures for a certain period of time and then you turn them based upon that. And there's also the Berkeley method, which is, I believe, you create a pile and then you don't touch it for 4 days, and then after that you turn it, I believe it's every 2 days or something like that. And then I think there's actually another method. What is it? The CMC method, which is the first 7 days you turn it every day. The next week after that you turn it 6 times, and then it go down from there, 5 and 4. So there's different methods out there. The key is that you want to maintain temperatures of above 131 degrees. And regardless of which method you use, what you're trying to do is you're trying to make sure that every piece of that compost is put into the hot center, right? We want to make sure that every piece of that compost hits the hot center, that it hits 131 degrees. And then we keep doing that. So when we're flipping the pile, we're making sure that every bit of that touches so that we're killing all the diseases and pathogens. In addition to that, if you hate weeds, 131 degrees is the temperature at which seeds go from viable to no longer viable. So if you hit those temperatures, you're also killing the weed seeds or any additional seeds that are in your compost that could possibly be there. So that's why we want to make sure that we're hitting these temperatures and making sure that we're getting all of the material into that hot center at some point in the turning process.
That makes sense, and makes me wonder, though, very interesting information, because of course, how you mentioned, if it gets on a specific lettuce, right, or one of those greens which you directly eat, then it makes complete sense why it would be harmful, right? Because whatever you were decomposing on your compost pile didn't fully decompose, so it got in touch with the leafy green, so now you could eat it. That makes complete sense. But then we also know, and obviously the details I'm not familiar with, but that they use animal manure of like pigs and things like that to spray monocrops, right? Like those huge agricultural farms. And then we in turn buy that product from the store. So then just makes me wonder how then that is safe, right? And how they've been doing it for so many years. So I don't know if you have anything to say about that. I'm just wondering.
So this is just all my opinion. I don't have evidence of any of this, right? I do know that, yes, there are people spraying liquid manures or waste onto fields to get the production up because they're adding soil organic material or biology to that. In my opinion, what you could do, right? Like if I were to do this, which I wouldn't, but if I were, and I would spray, I have cows and pigs and I'm taking the manure and I'm spraying it onto my fields through an irrigation system because that makes it simple, I would follow up with a pesticide or a fungicide or some type of aside that is going to kill my salmonella, my whatever else kind of pathogen that might be on that. And that will be my solution. Now I'm getting the nutrients to the plants and I'm also killing the pathogens that are there. So, and I could run that aside, whatever it is, through my irrigation system. So I don't have to do anything. I can push the liquid through the irrigation system. I can also push the liquid, the chemical that is going to kill those pathogens, and then I still get the growth that I want. So I think that's, if I were to do it, that's probably how I would do it.
Definitely, thank you. And I think the main thing is that we have to do the research and prove all things, right? Because at the end of the day, we can't say one way or another is the solution for everything. Again, you have to understand your context. You have to understand exactly what you're trying to do before you can make any specific decisions. And I guess that's why certain things work best for certain things when some might not work for your situation. So that's why it's very important to, really be sure on the research that you've done. And I guess it goes down to my next question, which are, what do you think are some of the most common misconceptions that people have about organic gardening?
Misconceptions. All right. I'm going to go back to real quick what you said. And I love this quote, right? The general underlying information is all the same, right? It's all the same. But your specific situation is very particular to your situation, right? So whatever you're trying to achieve is what you're trying to achieve. Whatever works for you, right? And it doesn't mean that it doesn't work for other people. They're just different, right? Like some people are very structured, so a very organized garden works for them. I like a jungle, so by broadcasting seeds, that works for me, right? So your individual situation is very important to what works for you, right? And we all have to understand that, like, the information is the same across the board for everybody, but how you implement it is very specific to your specific situation, your goal, your climate environment, the type of soil you have, the amount of rainfall you get, you name it, right? So I love that. And your situation is your situation, and it can be whatever you want it to be, and you don't have to follow the general rules. You can make it whatever you want. Right. And I just love that, because everything doesn't work for everybody. Right. You're in Florida. I'm in Nevada. You get a lot of rainfall. I get no rainfall. Right. So what works for me here might not work for you there. But the basic underlying science, how Mother Nature operates, is the same. But how we implement those practices are different. So I love that. And I just had to touch on that, because I think that's so important when you're going into your individual situation, your growing situation, right? Like, you have to be able to understand that, like, just because it worked over there doesn't mean that it's going to work for you, right? You might have to tweak it just a little bit. But going back to your other question about what are the misconceptions, organic. I think sometimes I never really thought about this question, so it's a good question. I think maybe cost. People think that going organic has to be, or it's more expensive, and it's not. It's definitely not more expensive. I think the opposite side of that is it's probably more labor intensive. Because when we're talking about going organic, we want to use a living soil, and compaction is a huge thing when it comes to a living soil. If you compact the soil, you stop the ability of oxygen to get to that soil, possibly even water. And when you cut off water and oxygen to a living organism, it dies, right? So I think a misconception is that it's expensive, and it doesn't have it's not, right? Like, we're using the waste streams that we have, which sometimes you can get for free. Maybe if you want to pay for those, you can, but we're not adding any of the additional things that regular traditional growers would, right? So we're not looking for specific GMO seeds. We don't need any of those additional safety nets that occur with that. In addition to that, we're not adding pesticides, we're not adding herbicides, we're not adding fungicides, we're not trying to control any of those. We're trying to foster an environment that takes care of itself like Mother Nature always does, right? And by doing that, we have less inputs, which makes it cheaper. Where it differs is, I think, in the labor required. So I think you're going to have more labor because you can't just push chemicals through a pipe or a hose and have it irrigated in that system, or run a tractor that has a tank on it, or a backpack sprayer or anything like that, right? You're going to have a shovel with some compost. You know what I mean? Like, it's going to be a little more labor intensive to be able to accomplish that. Or just weeding, right? Like, we're not going to spray herbicides. So if you don't want weeds, then you're going to have to go actually pick those out, which is going to be more labor intensive, but it's going to be cheaper.
Well, while listening to your answer, it made me think that maybe the main misconception or just lack of knowledge, and maybe if you could share your definition of it, is what does organic gardening actually mean?
That's a great question. Now, I was just talking to one of the guys I know. He's growing in his backyard, and what does organic mean? So we were looking at one of the products that he was using, and it said that it was organic. And then when we went to go do a little bit of research on that, the information provided by some of these governing agencies were very contradictory. And at the end of the day, what ended up happening was the product ended up being listed as organic because inactivity on the organization's behalf, on the governing organization's behalf. So when we're talking about what is organic and what is not organic, it can be very convoluted depending on how far down this rabbit hole you really want to go, right? In my opinion, organic is, I like to keep it simple. If it grows, it's organic. If it doesn't grow and it was formulated in a laboratory, it's probably not organic. Now, some things grown in a laboratory can be organic, right? But I'm specifically talking about the addition of specific chemicals that are created by a human being instead of, you can dive pretty deep into this, so I don't want to go too deep, but if it grows from the ground, then it's organic. That's kind of what I want to stick with. If it doesn't grow from the ground and it didn't come from the ground, then I'm going to say that it is an inorganic substance or material.
Well, I mean, I asked the question is because it's one of those words that, depending on who you ask or where you research it, you're going to get different answers. But it's a very powerful word when it comes to commerce and how we are sold products related to food and gardening and growing food in general. And, you know, I don't even know how to answer it completely, because if you look at organic chemistry, it's related to a carbon, right? If it has carbon compounds within the molecule, then it's considered an organic compound or organic molecule. But then why the word organic itself? I haven't done the research on organic chemistry, but just looking it up real quick, it seems like it's more from scientists calling it organic because it's something that is living organism, right? But then if you look at the food industry and labels of organic, you don't, I mean, might just be how I see it, but it's not necessarily that there is living organisms. It's more seen as there are no harmful chemicals in this product, when in reality doesn't have anything to do with each other, right? Like, the fact that you don't have harmful chemicals doesn't mean that something is organic. But it can. So it's just so funny because it's a word that maybe it doesn't even mean anything, but it has a lot of power when it comes to the products that we are being sold. So again, it goes back to, if you really want to grow an organic garden, then you need to understand for yourself what that means. And that's not going to come from just watching a video, a 10-minute, 20-minute video on YouTube, or even reading for a day or two. It's something that's going to come from a lot of research and then practice as well, right? You're going to have to put in the work yourself, to that when you put this certain inputs in your garden, these things happen. Also, that's why. And then you're going to be able to learn. Now, of course, you could learn from experts that have done that already. You could pay for a workshop, or a mentor, or whatever, right? A coach, which is now very, very common online. But at the end of the day, it's like a perfect term as to why it's important that we put things into practice, not just consume information and then think that we know it just because we consumed it, right? Like, we have to actually put it into practice.
Yes, I would say that you have to practice it, right, in order to get it to work. Now, I would say that this goes back to your comment where you said, it's individual, right? Depending on how much you want to know is how deep you're going to get into this education, and how deep you're going to get into putting it into practice, right? So some people are okay with the label organic because somebody else has certified it, right? Whereas to this gentleman that I was talking to, or I can use another customer that I had, she wanted to know whether my products were organic, and I can't answer that question because I don't know where it all came from, right? So it just depends on the type of person you are and what level that you want to take it to, right? Because if you keep it very surface level, it's going to be very easy. But when you start deep diving into this lady that I was talking to, she wanted to know if it had herbicides, pesticides, fungicides, all of the asides, if any of it was in there. And I can't tell you that, right? Because I don't know where the wood came from that was used. I don't know where the food came from that was used, right? I can tell you where I got the material from, but I can't tell you that that tomato came from an organic farm that didn't have herbicides or pesticides, or that seed was created from a environment to grow that plant that didn't have any of those materials. So it really depends on how deep you want to dive into it and how much of that you want to put into practice. I think the deeper you go, the more you'll find out, and the smaller options you'll have, for sure. So it depends on your level of how much do you care, right? How much do you really care and how much do you really want to get into the weeds? Because you can definitely get into the weeds on some of this stuff, right? Like you were saying, if you get down to the chemical aspect of it, I mean, what out there doesn't have a carbon molecule?
Or everything living based on organic chemistry, then everything has a carbon. Everything that is living, right, has a carbon molecule or atom. So then it makes it organic. And I guess, what really make this question evolve into something else than what I originally meant is because going back to, depending on your context, on what you're trying to do, how you're trying to grow it, then is how you're going to make those decisions, right? And obviously growing our own food impacts our health in a big way. And I think a big motivation for people to grow their own food, other than, of course, saving money, is health, right? Because you have fresher food and better quality. But then organic, similar to the word health. What is health, right? And depending on who answers it, is gonna be answered differently, right? But then then if there's disease, then there's treatments and symptoms, right? And depending on how it's treated, then it's going to be affected differently. And for example, there's holistic medicine,
Yes.
and it's like just another way of how growing your own food impacts every aspect of life, right? That you're trying to grow organically. Okay, and what does that even mean? You're trying to have health. What does that mean? So again, at the end of the day, is how you said, how much do you care about this, and how much do you want to learn and then implement. So it's really up to the person. It all takes time, effort. So we could start just small and go from there, right? Because at the end of the day, the point is to actually make some progress, not to get stuck in just information. So I guess if we start small and go from there is really the key thing, you know. Earlier you mentioned about, you know, the area that you're in the Nevada, Las Vegas area, and how it rains very little bit, obviously compared to here. It rains a lot in Florida. So tell me a little bit about, of course, in your case, how you deal with your climate and how you deal with the challenges, and then how someone independent of where they are, how they could deal with their own challenges regardless of where they are.
All right, that's a great question. So Nevada is challenging just because of the water issue we run into here, the soil, right? So we don't have any organic material in our soil, less than 1%. Our soil, chemically wise, is okay. They are kind of high in salts, and when I talk about salts, our water is also high in salt. So I believe the last time I checked, it was like 4,600 parts per million, which is massive, right? So if anybody knows anything about salts, they suck the moisture out of everything. So that's not the greatest thing to have in your soil. But how did I tackle this? So before I knew anything, I knew that my grandmother and my grandfather used compost. So I said, hey, let's just start out with compost. So I used compost and I added that to my soil and I started planting things. And what I noticed is that I would get growth, but it would peter out at some point. And then moisture was always an issue, and I couldn't get it to retain moisture. And I was like, boy, oh boy, this is going to be difficult. So I just kept adding more and more and more and more. And over the years, I've grown my soil organic material and I've grown my moisture holding capacity. So I can water less now. I don't have to add as much organic material, and it kind of does its own thing at this point. Very hands off. So that's kind of my approach. And then at some point in there, of course, I got into the worms and I started adding that to the soil. And then I got into soil biology, and now it's like, oh, okay, let's foster this, right? So if I would tell anybody, how do you get started in all of this? Goes back to what you said before this question, which was start with what you have. Start small, right? Don't spend thousands of dollars or buy equipment and garden beds and all these things to get started. Start with what you're comfortable with, right? Like, if you don't want to bend over, then maybe a raised bed is a good way to start, right? I'm getting older, my back's not as good as it used to be, right? But if that's start small, start somewhere, but start small, and then build on that. And you don't have to go from A to Z in a year, right? You don't have to go like me, getting into soil biology and understanding all of that, right? If you're okay with getting to the point where you can produce enough for you and your family, then get to that point and then maintain that. So start. I think that's the biggest thing. Like, start, and then start somewhere. Whether you start with compost or whether you start with a transplant. If you start with a seed, if you want to start that, then start. I think the key is to just start where you're at and then start with whatever you are comfortable. There's so many guides and so many things that you can look at, so many people you can talk to that say, start here, do this. I even have guides that say, start here and do this. But it's, what are you comfortable with? What do you want to start with? And then start with that. Start with one thing and just start. Once you get that and you have that, then slowly build onto that, right? It's just like our health. If you've ever gone to your doctor, they're like, hey, these fad diets, they don't work, right? If you want to lose weight, all this stuff, they always tell you start slow. Don't immediately go to only salads and then have one cheat day a month, right? You want to start with small, manageable things. So maybe cut out a soda, one soda. That's it. We want to start where we're at, and we want to start with something that's manageable. So no matter what your growing style is, no matter where you're at, here in Nevada, I was like, organic material. That was my number one thing. Like, I want to add organic material to the soil because there's nothing in it. So that would be my, like, how did I start here? And then if I had to tell anybody, what should you do? What am I doing right now? Do one thing, find out what that one thing is, and then get it started. Whether that's a seed, whether that's compost, whether that's figuring out what climate zone you live in and what will actually grow. Just start with one thing.
Definitely. That's a great way to put it, just to make it easier to start, right? And not suffer from analysis paralysis, where you're trying to analyze everything and then you don't actually do anything. And how you mentioned, even the last thing of finding your zone, it's a key way, because by finding your zone, now you're going to know the range of the temperature throughout the year. You're going to know approximately how much rainfall, and also how the sun is during the summer, winter, all the different seasons. Now, one thing that we do share in our climate, both in Florida and in the Las Vegas area, is that we get very strong heat and sun exposure, right? So what methods have you used that can help people with sun protection and, so that plants don't get scorched?
So that's difficult. Looking in my backyard right now. What do? I don't do much. I might spray in a tea onto the leaf surfaces in May. Not always, but sometimes I'll spray a tea to provide a little bit of stress management to the plant, to give it a little bit of more protection to the leaf surfaces. But the main thing that I do is I grow overstories with understories. And I'm sure you're familiar with food forest. I grow things that are tall, and then I grow things underneath it, right? So in this case, I've got a tree. I can grow strawberries and blackberries and raspberries out here, but they are underneath the tree where they get filtered light. They get direct light in the summertime or in the morning. They get filtered light through the afternoon, and then they're on a wall that gets zero sunlight after about 12 o'clock. So that provides protection for them through the heat of the summer. So I think understanding, I forget the gentleman that you were talking to, but when he creates his plans for people in their backyard for the forest, right, you have to understand what is going on in your specific grow environment, right? Where's the sun coming up? Where is it going down? What do you have in place that provides shade already, right? What gets wind exposure? What doesn't get wind exposure? And when I do that, I make sure that I always have protection from up top. The sun is brutal out here, so I'll try not to plant sensitive plants in direct sunlight, because it's absolutely brutal. So I like to use bigger plants, trees specifically, to provide some of that shade and filtered light to where I can still get things to grow. And that's kind of how I do it here. I don't use any shade cloths. I know that a lot of people here do. If you have the space for that, I don't like the way it looks personally. It's a aesthetic thing, but it definitely does provide assistance or help in the sun here. If you use a 50% shade cloth at a minimum, sometimes they go up to 70 and 80. But The shade is absolutely a necessity to give those plants a rest for sure.
I think the main strategy is trying to mimic nature, right? How a forest grows, and that way we minimize how much we have to take care of the plants uh, by mimicking nature. And of course, there are people that use shade um, cloths and other ways, but those can be expensive, and also they do wear with time, right? So then you have to replenish them every couple of years. Now, when it comes to soil, going back into it because it's so important, right? Once anybody that starts learning about growing their own food, they realize, hey, the most important thing is the soil. So, um, just wondering how much you could help us understand the concept of pH, because it is sort of complicated to understand, but it's very key, right? So, how does soil pH impact microbial life and nutrient ability? And what methods do you use to maintain optimal pH?
So I love this question, and I am going to give you probably an answer that you're not going to expect, and that is I don't care. In general, I don't care about the pH, and that is because plants, they take care of it, right? So I don't pH the water, I don't pH the soil. Now, I will say this: if you've got a soil or a compost that's like way out of whack, and we're talking about 9, 4, 5, right? Like really far away from 7, like 8 is okay, 6 is okay, but when we start getting outside of that, those you should probably adjust with something, right? Whether you use citric acid or whatever else organic to be able to adjust that. Yes, maybe. But in general, I don't care. The pH of the soil is going to be the pH of the soil. I can put as many inputs into that as I want. It's going to cost me a lot of money to adjust it, but the plant is going to adjust for the pH for its own. The plant is going to adjust the pH of the soil for what it needs. And the way it does that is through exudates. It brings in either bacteria or fungi, and the fungi transform or create acids which increase the pH, or increase the acidity of the soil, and then bacteria are going to create the opposite. So when it comes down to the actual pH, it doesn't. I don't look at it for anything. The plant brings in the right biology to be able to adjust the soil for what it needs, whether that's fungi or bacteria. Those are the two organisms that are going to control the pH of the soil, right? If we look at a forest system, nobody's going in there pHing the soil to make sure that the trees have the right pH system, right? The succession of the plant is going to decide that. So we know that forest systems are really high in fungi. That is because fungi provide the right pH level for that soil. And additionally, if we look at the other spectrum, right, grasses, they have high in bacteria because that is the type of pH that the soil enjoys. So I don't adjust. The plants adjust for that on their own with the exudates that they're releasing into the soil to feed the the exudates that they're releasing into the soil to feed the biology. So I don't pay attention to it. I just make sure that I have the right biology, the right amount of organic material in the soil, so that the plant has everything to choose from. It has that buffet to decide what it wants, when it wants it, and how it wants it.
Definitely. And that's why, again, it goes back to there's so much information, so many things we could learn, but we can't allow not knowing everything to then stopping us from actually taking action, right? Because there is an underlying science and just how nature works in every way, right? And there's layers to it. And throughout history, we learn new things related to biology, right, to mathematics, engineering, any aspect. And now we realize how this worked. But before we were doing it anyways, we just didn't understand the
Right.
mechanism yet. So where I'm going is that, hey, some people might know this mechanism, maybe you don't, or maybe I don't, but we shouldn't allow that to stop us from growing our own food. Because even though we don't know all the underlying mechanisms and the science behind every little step, that doesn't mean that we can't obtain a yield. And at the end of the day, that's the main thing about growing our own food, right? We want to obtain a yield. Now, once we obtain a yield, then how could we improve on it? Okay, that's when you next season you make some changes, you
Yep.
evaluate what you did and see how you could improve on it. But the main thing is don't allow lack of information, or maybe not lack of information, but lack of understanding of the information, to then stop you from actually taking action, because you want to learn more in doing than in listening to videos or reading. And you mentioned one very key thing, which is we should be able to know how healthy our garden is based on the life in it, right? The biology. So how do you assess that health of the soil biology in your garden? And what are some of the main indicators that tell you that the soil is a thriving, living soil?
Yeah, so the main things that I look at is the amount of microorganisms that are in there, and not just the amount, but specifically the types, right? So even when you go to the store, you can grab a bag of compost and you will have microorganisms in there, right? Even though it's dry and like dry with no access to oxygen, there will be something in there. But when you're looking at a soil, you want as many things in there as possible. So when I'm looking at a soil and how do I assess it, is I look at the soil, I look at it underneath my microscope, and I just want to make sure that I have all of the web, the soil food web, right? There's a diagram out there if you look at soil food web, and it has all these microorganisms and all these other organisms in there, and it's a predator prey concept, right? So I want to make sure that I have all the prey and all the predators in there to be able to cycle all the nutrients possible. And the only way you can actually do that is if you look at it underneath the microscope. Now, there's a couple of other ways that you can do it, right? Which is looking at the soil and just looking at your plant. If your plant isn't growing, is yellow, it has different colors, has spots, right? These are all indicators that you don't have everything in the soil that you should in order to get that plant everything it needs, right? So making sure that you have everything in there is important, but what you're looking for is having all the predators in there. For the majority of things, bacteria is the most abundant thing in the world, right? And like 1 teaspoon of soil has over, 1 or 2 billion microorganisms in it, right? So like, or bacteria in it, and that's massive amount. So we don't need any more prey. More than likely, we need the predators in there. So making sure that you have all those predators, those flagellates, those amoebas, those testate amoebas, those arcelias, you know what I mean? All of those organisms in the soil, you want to make sure you have your nematodes, all the different types of nematodes, because everybody thinks nematodes are bad. They're not. There's one type that's bad. But you want to make sure you have, mites. You want to make sure that you have worms. You want to make sure that you have earwigs. You want to make sure that you have all these microorganisms or these organisms in your garden, because they all perform a specific function to be able to give the plant exactly what it needs. And if you don't assess that, you don't look at it underneath the microscope, you won't know. So if I had to look at a soil just by looks and try to assess it, it'd be very difficult. I would probably be able to tell you that I could probably do a moisture test on it. I could probably look at the plants around it to see if it's doing well, and then I could probably smell it to see if it's got an earthy, good smell to it, or if it's going anaerobic, right? Besides that, it'd be really difficult to be able to tell exactly what's going on. I like to relate this to kind of going to the doctor, right? Like, how would you like to go to the doctor and say, I'm sick, and the doctor looks at you and says, all right, you're sick, and he diagnoses you just by looking at you? I mean, personally, I'm not okay with that. I don't want him telling me that I've got the flu or COVID or what else is out there, typhoid or measles, mumps, you name it. I don't want him looking at me and telling me that I have something. I need him to do a test of some sort and say, okay, you have this, now we're going to treat it. And I do the same thing with the soil, right? A lot of people look at plants and they're diagnosing plants just based off the look, and it's like you don't know. Unless you do an actual analysis, right, of the plant or the soil, you're not going to actually know what is wrong with that plant. And so I like to run my stuff underneath the microscope, and that's how I assess my soil, and that's kind of how I assess my plant health based upon what is or is not. Most of the time it's what is not in the soil.
So yeah, so most of the times what is not in the soil. So what is the soil lacking? It sort of, now that you just said it, sort of makes me think of our health, that a lot of the times many diseases come from the minerals and vitamins that we are lacking in our bodies. Of course, we do have a lot of toxins that our environment and diet are bad, right, for human health. But a lot of the times, those toxins wouldn't harm us, or we'll be able to get rid of them faster if we had all the vitamins and minerals and all the necessary things in our bodies. That since a lot of the times we have low concentrations of, then that's why people get sick from this or that. One of my last questions that I have is, how do organic techniques like composting, vermicompost compare to adding synthetic fertilizers in terms of long-term soil health?
It's a good question. First, I'd like to say that all of these techniques work, right? Synthetic products, they work. Plants grow, you get a yield. Sometimes they're larger, sometimes they're more colorful, right? If people are growing flowers, you might get more vibrant colors out of synthetics than you would in a organic system. The difference here is the inputs, the cost, and the effort at the end of the day. So in a synthetic system, you're going to continually have to feed that system, and you're only feeding a specific type of food, right? So the way I can relate to this is like a multivitamin, right? There's only so many things in a synthetic product that are in there that you're feeding into the soil. Whereas in an organic system, you're giving everything. The soil is deciding, when you have the right amount of microorganism, the soil is providing everything for it in that system. And you don't have to do anything for it except provide the source, right? And diversity here is the key. So when we're looking at long-term health in a synthetic system, when you use synthetics, you're feeding the plant, but you're not feeding the soil. And most of the time, these synthetic products are usually salts. And when you're using salts, you're stripping the soil of all the microorganisms that are in it. And when you're doing that, all you're really left with is the medium and the plant and the roots, and then the soluble nutrients that you're feeding it. Which means that at any point in time, if you stop that system is going to struggle on its own, which means that the plant is going to struggle and your yields and everything else. So the system degrades over time, and you have to continually maintain that system. Whereas in an organic system, it increases over time, but this is dependent also upon the amount of material that you're adding to it. So if we're looking at grasslands and forest systems, right? If you're looking at this out in nature, they take care of themselves. There's no intervention. The plant grows, certain plants die, pests eat at certain plants, it decomposes, it goes back into the soil, and then new grasses or new trees grow, and that's just a system that's in place, right? Mother Nature takes care of it on its own, and we can mimic this with our grows. And when we do that at home, what we can do is we can increase the amount of organic material and the health of the soil because we're adding to it. In a natural system, it maintains itself, But when we have an artificial system like our backyards or our gardens or our farms, we can actually increase that system in most situations, right? Like farmers can't add 2 inches of compost over acres and acres of land. That's going to be really expensive, first. And second, I don't know if they could even have access to that amount of material. But in a smaller system, we can do this, and we can increase that soil organic material matter. And when we increase that, we increase the amount of microorganisms in the soil. And when we do that, we increase the amount of nutrient cycling going on in the soil. And when we increase that, we increase the amount of nutrients available to the plants. And when we do that, we get a healthy plant. We get fruits, vegetables, we get flowers that look great, and we get plants that want to come back every year, right? These plants just automatically come back because they're like, hey, this is a good place to live. I'm going to produce seeds. I'm going to drop the seeds right here, and I'm going to grow again next year because these conditions were great. So an organic system increases year over year, and it gets better and better, and it requires less from us. Whereas a synthetic system or a chemical system will continually rely on us. And it's kind of like a healthcare system, right? The more we go to the doctor, the more we get medications. We're going to have to keep going back, getting better medications, right? Getting more things. Whereas if we eat the right things, and and we put the right things into our body, and we get a little bit of exercise in, we don't have to go to the doctor. We don't have to have them give us things because we're taking care of it on our own. And the same thing works for the soil.
That's a great way to put it, because if we let our food be our medicine, then we are going to the root cause rather than just treating symptoms. But of course, it takes effort, right? Because you have to do those initial inputs, which have cost some effort. But at the end of the day, in the long run, they're going to pay off in so many different ways, right? The return of investment is in many ways. Now, just to end it, the most important thing is, in your opinion, why do you think it's so important for people to learn how to grow their own food and provide at least some of the food that they consume?
I think it all comes down to personal health, right? Like, if you want to be healthy, then you got to put the right things into your body. And if you don't have the means to be able to purchase those things, right, then where are you going to get it from? You could grow it yourself, right? Like, everybody understands that microgreens have, like, what is it? Like, a little cup of microgreens has like an entire week's worth of nutrients in it. Like, where else are you going to be able to get that, right? So I think it's important, because if you want to be healthy, if you want to have the mental clarity, if you want to be able to live a longer life, if you want to be able to see your kids, get old, if you want to be able to see your kids have kids and have grandchildren, and maybe even see those grandchildren, then we have to care about what we're putting into our bodies. And if you don't, like I said, if you don't have the means to purchase those things, then the only other way to do it is to kind of grow it in our backyards or in our indoor spaces. If you have, space indoors to grow indoors, whether you're doing that hydroponically or soillessly or whatever your means are, it's important, because at the end of the day, all we have is the lifetime, and we don't know when that's going to end. And we all want to live the longest life possible to see all the things that are going to happen, right? Like, I'm still waiting for the flying cars. I don't know about you, but like, when are we getting those? And I'd like to be around long enough to be able to see that. And I don't have the means to be able to purchase all of the healthiest food, unfortunately. I don't. I grab what I can from the grocery store, and I try to grow the rest of it in the backyard. I've got asparagus, kale, other fruits and vegetables, right? And I want to be able to provide that for my family, because at the end of the day, I want to be able to be there long enough for my family to provide for them and be healthy. And that's why I think it's important. And that's why I want to share this information with other people, because not everybody has the means to be able to purchase everything. And if I can give them just a little bit of information to get them to grow something in their backyard, whether that's a tomato, a lemon tree, you know, maybe you have a jujube, whatever it is. If you can grow something, then you can be healthier than not having anything.
Definitely. And I mean, as you mentioned, health is the number one priority, and our food impacts our health directly. But of course, healthy food, which again, what does that mean? It tends to be very expensive, whether it is fruits and veggies or even livestock, right? If you're eating eggs and meat,
Yeah.
just buying fruits, veggies, and meat and eggs can be very expensive. But if you go to the aisles and you go to the processed food, which they mass produce it, then it's cheaper, right?
Yeah.
So, that's actually nothing new. I mean, just how it's written, there is nothing new under the sun, because at the end of the day, all throughout history, those that ate well were the ones that controlled the population, right? The kings back in the day, they were the ones that ate the meat and the good
Right.
veggies and fruits, right? The peasants, or the vast majority of the population, they would eat just wheat or rice. And to this day, that is still
Yeah.
how the vast majority of the population we eat. You know, really, as of this year is when I sort of changed my diet and I stopped eating so much refined, processed foods, right? And a lot of them come from wheat. And being from a Latin American country, South America, we eat a lot of rice and beans, right? So it's funny because the cheap food tends to be the not the healthier food. So if we learn to grow some of it, then at least we're taking back some control over our health. And it's also not just growing fruits and veggies, it's also keeping livestock, right? You could have some chickens, you have some quail. If you have a lot
Yeah.
of space, you could have some goats, some sheep, and even more space, you could have some cows, right? But at the end of the day, is just start where you are and don't be afraid to make mistakes. And as you get into it, you see how rewarding it is and how impactful it is in your life, the life of your family, and your community around. So I really appreciate that answer, man. And just before we end it, I just want to give you a second to invite the listeners to see where they could find you, how they could connect with you, ask you questions, and if you want to invite them to any specific events or platforms, how they could find you.
Yeah. I appreciate you having me on here, Andres. It's fantastic sharing this information with you, having these conversations and sharing it with other people. I think it's super important. Like you said, start where you're at and just start with whatever you can, right? I'm happy to share this information anywhere. I run the Las Vegas Worm Farm. You can just Google that. I have a Facebook, Instagram. That's about it for that side. If you do want a little more information, I do have a community that I have here on School. It's Grow Anything with Living Soil, where I share all of this information and more with you guys. I try to help everybody out, be as honest as possible, share as much information as I can, because I think that our health is important and everybody starts off in a different place. And if I can just help you grow one thing, whatever that is, for your health, then let's do that. Whether it's for your mental health, for your physical health, just one thing, I'd be happy to do that and happy to share it. So I'm happy to answer any questions that you guys have. Thanks again, Andres. This was great. I love this. And I appreciate you having me on.
Hey, thank you, man. I really appreciate it. And I put up here your school link real quick. Grow anything with living soil. Definitely encourage anybody listening to join. That way, you'll be able to connect and learn. And also, you have a community that you could uh, discuss things with and ask for help as well. So, thank you, man. I really appreciate your time. I think that we learned a lot when it comes to soil health, what a living soil is, and especially using worms for composting. So, anybody that made it this far, thank you for listening and hope to see you next time.
See you next time.